February 19th, 2005, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. 34-year-old Danielle Imbo meets up with her on-again, off-again boyfriend, 35-year-old Richard Petrone, and they spend the evening hanging out at a downtown bar. Richard says that he is planning to drive Danielle home, but after leaving together in Richard's pickup truck, they vanish without a trace. 3 years later, the FBI announces that they are investigating the possibility that the couple were the victims of a murder-for-hire plot, but they do not name any potential suspects, and no trace of Danielle, Richard, or the truck are ever found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be covering a bizarre missing persons case involving two victims, the 2005 disappearances of Danielle Imbo and Richard Petrone. Ever since the inception of this podcast, this has always been one of my more highly requested cases, so I figured that I was long overdue to release an episode. Danielle Imbo and Richard Petrone were single parents who each had a child and were involved in what was described as an on-again, off-again relationship. One night, Danielle and Richard made the last-second decision to meet up and hang out with some friends at a bar in downtown Philadelphia, but after leaving together in Richard's pickup truck shortly before midnight, they just seemed to completely fall off the face of the earth. Now, in most cases, where a person vanishes alongside their vehicle, the most logical explanation is that they accidentally drove into a body of water somewhere and have yet to be found. Indeed, Richard was supposedly driving Danielle back to her residence in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, which would have required them to cross the Delaware River, but a search of the river and other bodies of water in the area have failed to turn up anything, and it appears there might be a lot more to this story. The FBI became involved in the investigation, and in 2008, they publicly announced that they were exploring the possibility that Danielle and Richard were both victims of a murder-for-hire plot. Of course, they didn't share any specific details about why they believe this, or name any suspects, but one individual who has received a lot of attention is Joe Imbo, Danielle's estranged husband, and the father of her young son. Danielle and Joe were separated at the time she went missing, and while their divorce had not officially gone through yet, Danielle did not have any interest in rekindling their relationship. When Joe learned that Danielle had become involved with Richard, he did not react well, but while Joe has not been ruled out as a suspect, there is also no evidence that he had any involvement in the disappearances. While there have always been a lot of rumors and hearsay about what might have happened, it's never been conclusively proven if foul play actually took place. It's almost like these two people just literally vanished into thin air, so on this episode, we're going to explore all the different scenarios. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has around 70 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives, which are not available on our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the disappearances of Danielle Imbo and Richard Petrone. Our story begins in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 2005, and our two victims are 34-year-old Danielle Imbo and 35-year-old Richard Petrone. Danielle was born to parents John and Felisa Tobra, and also has a brother named John Tobra Jr. John Sr. actually found some fame during the 1950s under the name Johnny October, as he was the lead singer of a fairly popular doo-wop group known as the Four Dates. While John Sr. died of cancer in 1999, Danielle attempted to follow in her father's footsteps by becoming the lead singer of a pop rock band called the Schoolboys, who would perform in a number of local bars. However, Danielle's singing career pretty much came to a halt when she married her husband, Joe Imbo, in 2001, and she soon gave birth to their first child, Joe Jr. The couple lived in a condo in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, a township located next to the New Jersey-Pennsylvania state line, which is just over 15 miles east of downtown Philadelphia. But in 2004, while Danielle and Joe Jr. were homesick, Joe Sr. traveled down to Houston to attend the Super Bowl, and shortly after he returned, he announced that he had become involved with a woman he met on the plane. Joe soon moved out of the condo, and while the couple have not yet officially divorced, he and Danielle have remained separated for nearly a year. At this particular point, Danielle works from home as a loan processor for a mortgage company while she takes care of Joe Jr., who is currently 20 months old. She has also spent the past 9 months in what has been described as an on-again, off-again relationship with Richard Petrone. Born to parents Marge and Richard Petrone Sr., Richard Jr. has spent the brunt of his life living in Ardmore, a suburb on the west side of Philadelphia. Following his graduation from high school, Richard attended culinary school and found employment at his family-owned bakery, Viking Pastries, where he works alongside his father and is known for being particularly skilled at making wedding cakes. Richard also has a 14-year-old daughter named Angela, but since his relationship with Angela's mother ended without them ever getting married, Richard essentially raised his daughter since the age of 3, and they lived together in an apartment above Viking Pastries. However, when she reached her teen years, Angela decided that she wanted to try living with her mother, so Richard relocated from Ardmore to South Philadelphia in order to be closer to her, and they still maintain a strong relationship. Richard and Danielle first met each other while they were in high school, and she happened to be a close friend of Richard's sister, Christine. It was shortly after Richard moved to South Philadelphia that he reconnected with Danielle and they started dating. But due to the stress of her impending divorce and raising her son as a single mother, Danielle does not feel ready to take her relationship with Richard to the next level and needs some space to figure out what she wants to do. On the evening of Saturday, February the 19th, Joe Jr. was away with his father for the weekend, so Danielle decided to go out to dinner at a South Philadelphia sports bar with her mother Felice, as well as Richard's mother, Marge Petrone, and his sister Christine. Richard spent the evening having dinner alone at a bar called the South Philadelphia Tap Room, but decided to call up Christine on her cell phone to ask if she wanted to join him for drinks. While Christine declined the invitation, she was still with Danielle at the time Richard called, so she put Danielle on the phone with him, and they agreed to meet. Christine subsequently drove Danielle to the tap room to join Richard before they went their separate ways, and shortly thereafter, the couple went to Abilene, a bar and restaurant located on South Street. Danielle and Richard met up there with another couple named Anthony Valentino and Michelle McLaughlin, and the group spent the evening having drinks and watching a band perform. At around 11:45 p.m., Anthony and Michelle asked Danielle and Richard if they would like to accompany them to another nearby bar to see a different band perform, but the couple said they wanted to get home because they had plans for the following morning, and Richard said he was going to drive Danielle back to her condo in Mount Laurel in his black and silver 4-door 2001 Dodge Dakota pickup truck, which had the Pennsylvania license plate number YFH2319. Richard also remarked that he had managed to snag a good parking spot outside before he and Danielle left the bar together. Now, since no one can be certain where Richard parked, there are no witnesses who have ever been able to confirm actually having seen the couple climb into the truck and drive away, but what is clear is that after Richard and Danielle exited the bar, they would both inexplicably vanish without a trace. At around 9 a.m. on the morning of February the 20th, Danielle's brother John showed up at her condo in order to fix a curtain rod that Joe Jr. had pulled down a few days earlier, but when he knocked on the door, there was no answer. John also tried calling Danielle's cell phone, and it went straight to voicemail, but since he had a spare key to the condo, John unlocked the door and went inside. Since nobody was there, John called his mother Felice to see if she knew where Danielle was. This is when John learned that Danielle had met up with Richard the previous evening, so he figured that she may have decided to spend the night with him, and he was not overly concerned. However, at 11 a.m., Danielle failed to show up for a scheduled appointment she had at a hair salon where Christine worked. This prompted Christine to try calling Danielle and Richard's cell phones, but they both went straight to voicemail. Richard had been planning to invite some friends over to his apartment that afternoon to watch the Daytona 500 race, but he never contacted them. Throughout the course of the day, Richard's mother Marge kept trying to reach him on his home phone and cell phone, but kept receiving no answer. At one point, Marge asked her sister to stop by Richard's apartment, but there was no answer at the front door, and his pickup truck was not parked outside. By 3 p.m., Danielle had still not resurfaced, and John and Felice were gathered at her condo, and concern really started to grow when Joe Imbo showed up there to drop off Joe Jr. from his weekend visitation. John told Joe that Danielle was out with Christine and did not inform him she was missing, but John knew that it was very out of character for her to miss picking up her son. The Petrone and Otobra families eventually learned that Richard and Danielle were last seen leaving Abilene the previous evening, and they seemed happy and nothing was out of the ordinary. Richard Sr. and John would team up and spend the entire night driving around the area searching for the couple as well as Richard's pickup truck, but they failed to find any trace of them. Richard and Danielle were eventually reported missing to the police, who issued an APB for the truck. Over the next several weeks, the couple's friends and family would start posting and circulating thousands of missing persons flyers for them throughout Philadelphia and South New Jersey. Their disappearance was also featured on an episode of America's Most Wanted, and a reward was offered for information. Even though Richard had said he was going to drive Danielle from downtown Philadelphia back to her condo in Mount Laurel, there was no evidence that they ever made it there, and as far as the authorities could tell, the pickup truck was not picked up by any security cameras. Investigators would drive multiple routes from Philadelphia to Danielle's condo in Mount Laurel to search for potential clues, but found nothing. The quickest route would have required them to drive over one of the bridges crossing the Delaware River, such as the Benjamin Franklin Bridge and the Walt Whitman Bridge, but even though these bridges were equipped with cameras and tolls on the inbound side heading from New Jersey into Philadelphia, they did not exist on the outbound side of the bridge heading out of Philadelphia. Numerous searches would be performed of the Delaware River to see if Richard's pickup truck might have crashed in there, but even though a number of submerged vehicles were found, there was no trace of the truck or any evidence to indicate that it went into the water. There would be no activity on Danielle or Richard's cell phones, bank accounts, credit cards, or EasyPass cards after the evening of February the 19th, and since they both had very close relationships with their families and their children, it seemed unlikely that they would have disappeared voluntarily. At the invitation of the Otobra family, Joe Imbo was allowed to move into Danielle's condo in order to take care of Joe Jr., so they could put all their focus on the search effort. However, there was a lot of speculation that Danielle's fractured relationship with Joe may have played some role in her disappearance. I mentioned earlier that the couple were separated when Joe became involved with another woman he met during a trip to the Super Bowl in 2004. Joe even moved to Georgia to live with this woman, but when things did not work out between them, he returned to Mount Laurel in an attempt to win Danielle back. However, Danielle was not interested in reconciling their relationship, and she told her family that this led to a heated argument in which Joe grabbed their son's high chair and bounced it off the wall. While Joe would later say that he didn't think this ever happened, the alleged incident prompted John to change the locks on Danielle's condo and have a sit-down conversation with Joe in which he advised him that he needed to be more civil with his sister. In spite of their personal issues, Danielle still wanted Joe Jr. to have a relationship with his father, so Joe was allowed to have frequent visitation. However, it became apparent that Joe was none too happy when he learned that Danielle had started a new relationship with Richard. According to the Petrone family, Joe phoned Richard several times in order to demand that he stay away from his wife, and even went so far as to threaten physical violence. On one occasion, just before Thanksgiving of 2004, Joe allegedly called Richard at Viking Pastries and threatened to go there with a baseball bat to kill him. Since she had her own close relationship with Danielle, Christine summed up the situation with Joe by stating, quote, "He didn't want her, but he didn't want her to be with anyone else," end quote. Phone records did confirm that there were numerous calls from Joe to Richard, but during an interview, Joe shared a different version of events. Even though he claimed they never met in person, Joe said that when he spoke to Richard on the phone, he was very open about the fact that he did not like him dating Danielle, but he maintained that Richard was the one who was threatening towards him. Joe also said that he made a tape recording of his supposedly threatening phone call to Viking Pastries and turned it over to the police, but they later informed Danielle's family that Joe had the passcode to her cell phone and had used it to listen to her voicemail. For his part, Joe claimed that on the night that Danielle and Richard went missing, he and Joe Jr. were at a kids' party in Toms River, New Jersey, which is over 40 miles east of Mount Laurel. Numerous witnesses could verify Joe's alibi, including his stepfather, who was a former New York City police officer, his stepfather's son, who was a police detective in Dover Township, and many other active police officers. Joe also claimed during interviews that he took a polygraph test and was told by the police that he passed, though they have never publicly confirmed or denied this, and only told the press that they don't discuss the results of lie detector tests. Prior to her disappearance, Danielle had told both Joe and Richard that she needed space from them, and Richard reportedly told her that he understood, given that he had been a single parent himself. One of Danielle's friends, Don DeSimone, even told the press, quote, "I hate to say this because I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, but she didn't want to be with either of them," end quote. Indeed, a number of Danielle's friends and family members would confirm that Richard's feelings for her were much stronger than her feelings for him. Another friend of Danielle's told the press that she had described Richard as a quote-unquote really great guy but a little rough around the edges, though she had been reluctant to officially break up with him since he was always so kind to her. According to Don DeSimone, the drama surrounding her separation and impending divorce had caused Danielle to lose a lot of weight and start chain smoking. 3 days before she went missing, Dawn said that Danielle called her to say that she was planning to end things with Richard, as she wanted to spend more time focusing on herself and raising her son and saving up enough money to move them into a bigger place. But when Richard spoke to Danielle on the phone on the night of their disappearance and told her he missed her, she ultimately decided to get together with him for drinks. Even though the Petrone and Otobra families have been close for many years, the disappearances caused them to grow apart and stop speaking with each other, as each family had differing ideas about what might have happened. While the Petrones would not publicly say whom they believed was responsible, they did express their belief that Danielle was the intended target and that Richard was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Otobres briefly contemplated the idea that Richard may have caused Danielle's disappearance before he took off on his own, but since no evidence could be found to indicate that Richard was still alive, this idea was completely discounted by law enforcement. The Otobras also wondered if Richard may have been involved in drugs or gambling or something illegal, which caused he and Danielle to go missing, but no evidence was found to support this, and there was nothing in either of their backgrounds to suggest they had any dark secrets which could have paved the way to their disappearances. Well, in February of 2008, the FBI held a press conference in which they announced that they were now investigating Danielle and Richard's disappearances as a double homicide and exploring the possibility that they were both victims of a murder-for-hire plot. The FBI stated that even though they do not ordinarily work on unsolved missing persons cases, they can become involved in investigations with potential murder-for-hire plots, and they have all but ruled out the possibility of Danielle and Richard being the victim of a kidnapping or a random act of violence. Indeed, John Otobra would claim that shortly after the couple were reported missing, a Philadelphia police officer told him, quote, "No one is ever going to find anything, it's too clean." While the FBI have never shared any specific details about why they believe a murder for hire might have taken place, or named any suspects, they later admitted that they made this announcement in order to, quote-unquote, shake the tree and see if it would produce any substantial new leads. As for Joe Imbo, he eventually relocated to South Carolina with Joe Jr., though the boy would still get to visit Danielle's family a couple times per year. The stress of the situation caused Joe to suffer a heart attack at the age of 37, but he wound up surviving. In regards to Joe's status as a potential suspect in this case, the lead investigator from the FBI, Special Agent Vito Roselli, has stated, quote, "I don't have the evidence to arrest Joe. I have also not ruled him out," end quote. During one interview, Joe claimed that Roselli told him, quote, "I don't think you did this, but I think you're involved in some way." Richard's daughter Angela remained in the care of her mother, and just under 5 years following her father's disappearance, she gave birth to a son of her own named Timothy. Angela would also eventually get married and take over her grandmother's job at Viking Pastries. In 2022, Adventures with Purpose, a private search and recovery dive team which specializes in checking bodies of water for submerged vehicles containing missing persons, announced that they were going to check sections of the Delaware River to see if they could turn up any sign of Danielle, Richard, or the missing pickup truck. One of the team's members, Doug Bishop, told the press, quote, "I know the FBI's position is that there was foul play and that the vehicle somehow made it to a chop shop. However, there's no actual information leading us to suspect those types of conclusions. So our speciality is water. We know we have a couple that's missing and missing with their vehicle, and we're going to do what we do best," end quote. However, their search efforts have yet to find anything, so after nearly 20 years, Danielle Imbo and Richard Petrone continue to remain missing persons. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So over the past 2 decades, this has probably become one of the more heavily discussed missing persons cases of the modern era, as it's been covered on a number of true crime podcasts, as well as TV shows like Disappeared, who produced an episode titled A Bridge Too Far, which aired in June of 2017. At the time of this episode's release, we're only about 7 months away from reaching the 20-year anniversary of when Danielle Imbo and Richard Petrone went missing, and it's incredible to think that we still have no real evidence of what might happen to them. I've already talked about how when someone goes missing alongside their vehicle, the most logical explanation is that they drove into a body of water somewhere, but most of the major bodies of water between Philadelphia and Mount Laurel have been searched, and they've always come up empty. Adventures with Purpose have pretty much become the go-to organization in regards to recovering submerged vehicles containing missing persons, and have been responsible for solving no less than 30 of these cases over the past 4.5 years, but even they have not managed to find any success here. While the idea of an accidental crash into the water cannot be completely discounted, I know some eyebrows were definitely raised in 2008 when the FBI publicly announced that they were exploring the possibility that Danielle and Richard were the victims of a murder-for-hire plot. But it's now been over 16 years since they made that announcement, and to this day, they've remained very tight-lipped about why they believe this theory or if they have any strong evidence to support it. However, if there wasn't a decent chance that a murder for hire had taken place, the FBI probably never would have become involved in the investigation in the first place, since they don't ordinarily take on standard missing persons cases. I still remember the quote from Danielle's brother, John Otobra, who said he was told by a police officer that his family likely wouldn't receive answers because the whole thing was, quote-unquote, too clean. Indeed, if foul play did take place, then whoever was responsible did an incredibly thorough job of disposing of the victims' bodies and Richard's pickup truck. So if this was a murder for hire, the obvious suspect would seem to be Danielle's estranged husband, Joe Imbo, but we'll get back to him in a moment. And the one theory that I know we can completely discount right away is the possibility of Danielle and Richard disappearing voluntarily, as there has been no paper trail or confirmed sightings of them in 2 decades. On the aforementioned disappeared episode, John Atobra was interviewed and shared a story about his family receiving a tip from a so-called psychic who said that Danielle was being held captive inside a boxcar at a train yard under the Walt Whitman Bridge, and she needed to be rescued very quickly before she died. Of course, the police were very skeptical about this tip, but John actually went to the trouble of breaking into the train yard and started searching the boxcars for Danielle, but of course, he found nothing and was taken into custody by police, who lectured him about how foolish his actions were. While it's easy to scoff at most of the tips that psychics provide in cases like this, I can definitely understand why a victim's family member would still be willing to explore them, especially when there is no evidence or viable leads and the family is desperate for anything. Another poignant aspect of the disappeared episode is seeing interviews with Richard's daughter, Angela. At the time he originally went missing, Angela was only 14 years old, and she would appear on TV and give a tearful statement at a press conference in which she begged for information about her father. I always find it heartbreaking when the children of missing persons give interviews many years later after they become adults and have lived through not knowing what happened to their parent. By the time she was interviewed on Disappeared, Angela had gotten married and had a son, but not only was Richard not around to enjoy being a grandfather, but he did not get to see his daughter follow in his footsteps and start working at his family-owned bakery. In addition to John and Angela, the Disappeared episode featured an interview with Richard's mother, Marge Petrone, as well as Richard's friend, Anthony Valentino, who hung out with him at Abilene on the night he and Danielle went missing, and was technically the last known person to see the couple alive. Even though both the Petrone and Atobra families have worked diligently to keep this case in the spotlight and spread awareness about their loved ones' disappearances, the two families have spent the past 2 decades working separately from each other and are pretty much completely estranged. This seems to stem from their differing views about what happened, as it seems like the Petrones believe the disappearance was somehow connected to Danielle, while the Atobras think the same thing about Richard. In fact, while no one flat out said this, I'm sure there was probably initial speculation that Richard might have done something to Danielle and then took off on his own accord, or that perhaps their disappearance was even a murder-suicide in which Richard decided to intentionally drive his pickup truck into a body of water with both of them inside. Now, I want to make it clear that I believe there's zero chance that happened, as by all accounts, Richard was a genuinely good guy who wouldn't have been capable of something like that, particularly when you consider how close he was to his daughter and his family. But I do have to acknowledge that the Disappeared episode does kind of downplay the idea that Richard and Danielle may not have had much future together as a couple. If you look at the earliest media coverage of this case, the consensus from Danielle's friends and family seems to be that Richard had much stronger feelings for her than she did for him, and that Danielle seemed to be on the verge of ending the relationship. This wasn't because Richard had done anything wrong, but Danielle was just experiencing a lot of stress over her separation and impending divorce from her estranged husband, Joe, as well as the drama and alleged threats between the two men. It sounds like she just wanted to take more time to focus on herself and her son, so being in a relationship with anyone was just not a top priority at that time. In spite of this, Danielle did agree to meet up with Richard and hang out with him at Abilene on the night they went missing, and according to Anthony Valentino, they did seem pretty happy together and even kissed. But personally, I think that the ambiguous, on-again, off-again nature of the relationship throws a major complication into this whole theory about a murder-for-hire plot. The fact of the matter is that Danielle and Richard's decision to meet up that night was a spontaneous last-second one, so if someone wanted to murder one or both of them, how could they have even known ahead of time where they would be? And there's also a lot of ambiguity about where exactly the couple went after they left Abilene. According to Anthony, Richard said he was going to drive Danielle home to her condo in Mount Laurel, and investigators have attempted to explore every route there from downtown Philadelphia in an attempt to figure out what happened to them. But how can we even be certain they headed in that direction? What if they decided to go elsewhere? You see, even though Danielle and Richard were seen leaving Abilene, there was no one who can actually confirm having seen them climb into Richard's pickup truck and drive away, and neither the couple nor the truck were picked up by any security cameras in the area. We know that Richard told Anthony that he managed to snag a good parking spot, which implies that it was relatively close to the bar. Abilene was located on South Street, which is a busy section of downtown Philadelphia, and given that this was a Saturday night, it's probably not too surprising that Danielle and Richard wouldn't have stood out, and no witnesses have been able to recall something as mundane as them climbing into the truck. If Richard was parked on the street, then I think this would exclude the idea of them being abducted or carjacked, as I'm sure someone would have seen something. However, if the truck was inside a parking garage or a deserted lot, then I suppose it's not impossible that something could have happened to them without attracting any attention. The biggest argument which has been used against the idea of the truck crashing into a body of water is that in order to drive to Mount Laurel, the quickest route would have been for Richard to use one of the bridges which crossed over the Delaware River, with the closest ones being the Benjamin Franklin and Walt Whitman bridges. And while it's certainly not impossible that the truck could have veered off the road into the river, these were such heavily trafficked bridges that I'm sure someone would have seen something, and a crash like this would have left behind noticeable damage. Richard and Danielle implied that they wanted to go straight home because it was late and they had plans the following morning, but for all we know, maybe they decided to go somewhere else first in order to grab something to eat or to talk or even make out. Maybe they never got the opportunity to head in the direction of Mount Laurel before something happened to them. Even though there doesn't appear to be any logical reason for him to do so, perhaps Richard elected to take a longer, more scenic route, or even took a wrong turn somewhere, and the truck could have ended up in another body of water or a section of the Delaware River which has never been searched. While Richard had been drinking that night, there's no indication that he was intoxicated, though whenever you're driving on dark roads late at night in the middle of winter, anything can happen. I know that during the early stages of the investigation, there was a tip about a gate near the Philadelphia waterfront which had been found broken and seriously damaged, as if a vehicle had gone through it, but when that particular section of the Delaware River was searched by divers, it only turned up a number of other submerged vehicles which were not the pickup truck. I previously made mention of Adventures with Purpose, an organization which specializes in searching bodies of water for submerged vehicles, and they have managed to help solve at least 30 missing persons cases. If there's anyone who would be capable of finding and recovering Richard's missing pickup truck, it would be them, but their searches have always come up empty. Adventures with Purpose has a YouTube channel in which they have posted videos of their search efforts in this case, and at one point, they filmed themselves traveling down the Schuylkill River, which flows southeast into Philadelphia before it joins up with the Delaware River. Theoretically, if Richard was driving to Mount Laurel, there would be no reason for him to be anywhere near the Schuylkill River, since it's in the complete opposite direction. However, if for whatever reason, the couple changed their plans and decided to go to Richard's apartment in South Philadelphia instead, then yes, one of their possible routes could have taken them past this river. This YouTube video showcased how there are roads which run past the Schuylkill that don't have any barriers or guardrails, so it would definitely be possible for a vehicle to veer off the road into the water late at night and completely disappear without leaving any evidence behind or anyone seeing anything. I'm not sure if the Schuylkill has been searched as extensively as the Delaware, but thus far, no evidence has ever been found to support the idea that it went into this river. All that being said, I have to harken back to the fact that if these disappearances were a simple accidental death caused by driving into the water, I don't think the FBI would have become involved in this investigation, let alone gone to the trouble of holding a press conference to announce the possibility of a murder for hire. By their own admission, the FBI made this announcement in hopes that it would rejuvenate the investigation and bring about new information, but while things ultimately didn't work out that way, I'm sure they wouldn't have gone public with this theory unless there was some legitimacy to it. So on the surface, the most obvious suspect would be Joe Imbo, and while the FBI has never named him as a suspect, they have not ruled him out either, and you can interpret the statements they made about him in a number of different ways. What does seem certain is that if Joe was involved in murdering Danielle and Richard, he couldn't have committed the crime himself, as he has a rock-solid alibi placing him in Tom's River on the night of the disappearances. But if you search through online discussions about this case, you'll see a couple of people refer to Joe's alibi as quote-unquote too perfect, implying that he made a conscious decision to place himself in the presence of numerous eyewitnesses, many of whom were police officers, when he knew the murders would take place. And since Joe had weekend visitation and took his son to Tom's River with him, he could have considered this the perfect opportunity to send someone to kill Danielle. Well, obviously, I don't think Joe would ever win any awards for Husband of the Year, since he became romantically involved with another woman during a trip to the Super Bowl while his wife and infant son were both homesick. And when this other relationship did not work out, Joe made an attempt to come crawling back to Danielle, but when she showed zero interest in getting back together, he did not take it well, as he allegedly lost his temper and tossed a high chair during an argument and made some angry, threatening phone calls to Richard when he found out he was dating his wife. But while these stories do not make Joe look good, I haven't heard anything to indicate that he was abusive or ever crossed the line into physically assaulting Danielle, so would he really have been cold-blooded enough to arrange for the murder of the mother of his child? Hell, did he even have any criminal associates who would have been willing to commit a crime like this on his behalf? Well, if he did, it sounds like investigators have not turned up any evidence to prove it, such as a record of him making phone calls to potential killers during this time period, or a large sum of money suddenly disappearing from Joe's bank account. And of course, the biggest issue is trying to figure out the logistics of how Joe could have pulled off a murder-for-hire plot. So to recap, Danielle spent the first part of the evening of February the 19th, 2005, going out to dinner at a sports bar with her mother Felice, as well as Richard's mother Marge and his sister Christine. Richard spent the evening having dinner alone at an establishment called the South Philadelphia Tap Room, but decided to call Christine on her cell phone to ask if she wanted to join him for drinks. While Christine was unable to do so, she was still with Danielle at the time, and she agreed to it, so Christine drove Danielle to the tap room to meet Richard, and they soon traveled to Abilene. Like I mentioned earlier, Richard and Danielle's decision to hang out that night was a last-second one, and Christine has always said that she was probably the only person who knew ahead of time that the couple were going to hang out that night. Looking at the timeline, Joe probably would have already been in Tom's River at that point, so how could he have known that Danielle and Richard would meet in downtown Philadelphia that night? How can one orchestrate a murder-for-hire plot if they have no advanced knowledge of where the targets will be? Now, it turned out that Joe had the passcode for Danielle's cell phone and was covertly checking her voicemails, so it is possible he could have found out what Danielle's original plans were that night, but she arranged to meet Richard during a conversation on Christine's cell phone, not her own. There's nothing to indicate that Richard and Danielle communicated at all after she told him she needed a break from the relationship, and they didn't even speak with each other on Valentine's Day. I suppose the alternate explanation is that Joe only hired someone to kill Danielle, and it was just an unlucky coincidence that she happened to cross paths with Richard that night, and he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Well, it's possible that this killer spent the entire evening following Danielle and did not actually murder her until she was with Richard. This does not seem like the most practical plan, since she went out to dinner with other people beforehand for a ladies' night, so this assailant would have needed to shadow her for at least several hours. A more logical scenario for a murder for hire is if the perpetrator was lying in wait for Danielle at her condo, as Joe certainly would have known that she would be alone and not have Joe Jr. with her. Remember, even though there's no evidence that Danielle and Richard ever made it to Mount Laurel, there's no evidence that they didn't either. But as far as I can tell, no one at the condo complex or in the neighborhood reported seeing or hearing anything unusual that night. If a killer was waiting there, it would make sense for them not to make their move until after Danielle was dropped off and Richard drove away, unless, of course, Danielle decided to invite Richard inside. However, when John Atobra arrived at the condo at around 9 a.m. that morning, the front door was locked, and there was no evidence anyone had recently gone inside the condo or that a crime took place there. When you look at how these series of events unfolded, there's no way a murder-for-hire plot orchestrated by Joe to kill both Danielle and Richard could have conceivably worked, unless he only planned to kill Danielle, and it was just pure chance that Richard just happened to be with her at the time. But an awful lot of luck would need to go Joe's way for him to have gotten away with this for 2 decades. If he hired someone, they must have been a truly skilled professional. Not only did they dispose of 2 bodies and a pickup truck so thoroughly that no trace of them has ever been found, but they did not leave any strong evidence behind and have also managed to keep their mouth shut this entire time. For their part, the Ottobre family have never directly accused Joe of any wrongdoing, as both sides were able to maintain a cordial enough relationship that Joe Jr. was allowed to make yearly visits with the Ottobres. Of course, it's entirely possible that Joe is completely innocent, and the FBI believes that a murder-for-hire plot was orchestrated by someone else for completely different reasons. Perhaps Richard was always the intended target, and Danielle was the one who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. However, investigators have repeatedly stated that they found nothing in Richard's background to indicate he was involved in something illegal, such as drugs or gambling, which would have made him a target for premeditated murder. Apparently, rumors have circulated about at least 2 different individuals possibly being the hitman in the so-called murder plot. One of them is Anthony Rodesky, who is currently serving a 60-year prison sentence for a pair of murders which took place in New Jersey in the months following these disappearances. One of these victims was Ranjit Patel, a hotel owner from Mapleshade Township, who was shot to death during a robbery attempt on March 22, 2005. And the second victim was James Mickno, a flooring company owner who was shot 7 times by Rodesky in Berlin Township just 10 days later on April 1st. Prior to his arrest, Rodesky had been a paid informant for the New Jersey State Police, and since both these murders took place in relatively close proximity to Mount Laurel, I can see why it would be tempting to look at him as a potential suspect in this case. While investigators have confirmed that there is no direct evidence linking him to the disappearances of Danielle and Richard, they also say that Rodesky has not been ruled out as a suspect. The other individual rumored to have been the hitman in this case is Robert Carey, a former resident of Palmyra, New Jersey, who was arrested on the charges of attempted murder and identity theft in April of 2010. Carey had spent the past decade running a $1 million drug operation in which he illegally sold prescription painkillers throughout New Jersey and Pennsylvania. During one 2-year period, Carey forged prescriptions for over 142,000 tablets of OxyContin and Percocet and got hit with the attempted murder charge after severely beating a man who owed him a drug debt and causing him to lose an eye. However, shortly after his arrest, Carey took his own life after using a shoelace to hang himself in his jail cell. Much like Rodesky, it's not entirely clear to me why Carey was suspected of being involved in this case, but while no evidence has ever been found to implicate him, I get the impression that he has not been entirely ruled out either. I'm guessing that no tangible connection has been found between either of these men and Joe Imbo to indicate that he hired them to commit a murder, but I'm sure that Carey's drug operation has helped fuel rumors that Danielle and Richard's disappearances might have been drug-related. And if Rodesky had any involvement, then perhaps the crime was some sort of robbery gone wrong. Indeed, even though the FBI seems to have ruled out the possibility of the couple being the victims of a random act of violence, I could see something like that happening. Philadelphia was definitely known for having a huge carjacking problem during this time period, so it's very possible that someone could have killed the couple in order to steal Richard's pickup truck, and it eventually wound up in a chop shop somewhere. But of course, the main problem with that theory is that while carjackers can be capable of committing murder in order to steal someone's vehicle, how often will they go to the trouble of disposing of the body of their victim, let alone the bodies of 2 victims? If a carjacking took place, it just seems more logical that the perpetrator would shoot Richard and Danielle and leave their bodies lying by the side of the road somewhere before stealing the truck. FBI Special Agent Vito Roselli stated during an interview in 2014, quote, "Making 2 people in a truck disappear with no witnesses and no evidence of any kind for 9 years suggests methodical planning," end quote. So overall, where do I personally fall on this one? Well, I honestly have no clue. Under normal circumstances, I'd probably go with Occam's razor and assume that the truck wound up in a body of water somewhere and is still submerged to this day, with Richard and Danielle's bodies inside. That could very well be what happened, but it definitely appears like the FBI and all the other investigating law enforcement agencies know a lot more information about this case than they're releasing publicly, and likely have good reason to believe that foul play took place and there was a murder for hire involved. I read some comments online from people who live in the area and claim that the most prominent rumor which has always circulated is that the authorities secretly believe that Joe Imbo was responsible for what happened, but at this point, they just do not have the evidence to do anything. For all we know, that might be the truth, but I still have a lot of unanswered questions before I would feel comfortable pinning this crime on Joe. Unfortunately, this is just one of those missing persons cases in which it seems like the victims literally just vanished into thin air, and it boggles my mind that no new evidence has surfaced during these past 2 decades. But the authorities have stated that they believe there are people out there who know the truth about what happened, so in order to break this case wide open, someone might need to come forward. So if you happen to have any information about the disappearances of Danielle Imbo and Richard Petrone, there are many different law enforcement agencies you can contact, including the Philadelphia Police Department at 215-686-3013, the Mount Laurel Township Police Department at 856-234-1414, and the Camden County Sheriff's Office at 856-225-5470. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 6 years, our Patreon page has released around 70 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about 2 separate boating mysteries which were featured in Unsolved Mysteries: the disappearances of the Liebling and the Antigua. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my 2 co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, cover yet another case which was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, the 1991 murder of Jamie Santos. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 60 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I just wanted to remind everyone that The Trail Went Cold will be returning to the True Crime Podcast Festival, which is being held at the Denver Marriott Westminster in Colorado from July the 12th until the 14th. And as a bonus, my brother Phil will also be attending, as he hosts his own paranormal-themed podcast titled Unexplained Incorporated. So you'll be getting 2 warders for the price of 1. If you would like to purchase tickets, we have a 15% discount code, so please visit truecrimepodcastfestival.com and enter the promo code TRAIL. Once again, that's truecrimepodcastfestival.com, and the promo code is TRAIL for 15% off tickets. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. So have yourselves a great week, and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.